Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. On behalf of the Fostering Connections Resource Center, this is Hope Cooper, and it's my pleasure to be part of hosting this webinar today. In just a few minutes, I will introduce Kathleen McNaught with the American Bar Association's Center on Children and the Law. She will lead the presentation today. So I'm just going to look at the next slide and quickly provide an overview of the webinar today. We will take a quick look at the tools so that you know how to be in touch with us during the webinar. Then we'll provide a brief overview of the Fostering Connections Resource Center. After that, you'll hear from Kathleen, who will provide a review of the Fostering Connections Law, focusing on the education stability provisions. Following that, there will be a focused discussion around the transportation of keeping children in their current schools, and a very brief wrap-up. So quickly, just about the tools. For those of you who are familiar with this, I think everything will be very easy to understand. For those of you who are new, please take a look at the toolbar. The top of it, the top left of the toolbar, you'll see arrows. I think it should show up in red for most of you. And if you click them, it will hide your toolbar. And if you click the arrows again, it should open your toolbar. The toolbar is important in that it lets you be in touch with us. If you have a question, please just look for the question bar about halfway into your toolbar. It should say questions. You can just write your question in and then press the send button. We really welcome your questions. This is a very rich topic. We are online and ready to answer your questions during the webinar. We'll try to address as many as possible. We know that we won't be able to answer all of them, but we do plan on compiling all the questions, providing responses, and sending those out in about a week or so from today. So there will be a complete set of questions and answers. So we do invite you to be in touch with us. The next slide, I'd just like to take a minute to introduce any of you who aren't familiar yet with the Fostering Connections Resource Center. The Resource Center is here to be a service and a support to the field, to state decision makers, tribal decision makers who are responsible for implementing the Act. We have generous contributions from 9 foundations, and they're listed here. The Annie E. Casey Foundation, Casey Family Programs, Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption, the Duke Endowment, the Eckerd Family Foundation, Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative, Sierra Health Foundation, the Stewart Foundation, and Walter S. Johnson Foundation. We're very grateful for their support. And if we look at the next slide, you'll get a sense of the scope of work that the Resource Center provides. We focus on providing new information and resources to help support implementation of all aspects of the Act. We provide some technical assistance, and we do our best to direct technical assistance requests to other existing technical assistance providers as well. We invite you to take a look at the website to stay up to date on federal regulatory guidance, events going on in the field, literature, news, state events, new resources and tools that are being added to the website every week. We collect those from a wide range of sources. So please do visit the website to get a sense of current events and implementation activity. And we do our best to showcase what's going on with state legislation and other state activity, administrative rulings and such that support implementation. And we do host a number of mailing lists. I gather many of you are on one, which is how you probably learned about the webinar. But if you are not, we invite you to join a mailing list. You can join by issue topic if you're particularly interested in just education. We have a mailing list for that, or we have mailing lists for adoption and the other topics as well. Going to the next slide, I just quickly want to acknowledge that the Resource Center really is a partnership of many different organizations, primarily nonprofit organizations at the national level, in close collaboration with state-based organizations as well. We are organized around the topic areas of the Act, and each of those areas has a manager here at the Resource Center. Their names are listed first, and they work in very close consultation with a network partner who is a national organization and a leader in that particular topic area. So today we're very pleased to be here with our partner on the education issues from the ABA Legal Center for Foster Care and Education. So I think I'm going to turn things over to Kathleen McNaught.
Great. Thank you so much, Hope, and thanks to the Fostering Connections Resource Center for inviting me to present and join you today for this webinar. We, as Hope stated, we are the lead network partner on the education piece of the Fostering Connections implementation, and we work very closely with Hope and the Fostering Connections Resource Center. Our legal center actually is a project that was born before Fostering Connections was passed. We are about 4.5 years young, and we were created as a collaboration with the Juvenile Law Center and the Educational Law Center in Pennsylvania, and with support from Casey Family Programs and most recently with Annie E. Casey Foundation. So we not only support the Resource Center in their work in implementing Fostering Connections and the education provisions, but we also have a bit of a broader scope on the education topic, focusing on any educational needs for children in foster care. So you've got our information there on slide 7. But the topic for today is Fostering Connections, and as many of you know, Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act was signed into law on October 7th of 2008, and it is the most significant federal reform for abused and neglected children in more than a decade. Related to education, the most significant piece to Fostering Connections is that for the first time, child welfare law identifies some very specific provisions related to the need for educational stability for children in foster care. And what we're going to do today is go through some of those stability provisions, but really focus in on the topic of transportation. So let's start with the first stability provision that I think is important to know about Fostering Connections, and you can find that on slide 9. And that is the requirement that the child's case plan has to include insurances that the placement of a child in foster care takes into account the appropriateness of the current education setting and the proximity to the school in which the child is enrolled at the time of placement. Now, to call both of those provisions new with Fostering Connections is a little misleading, because the truth is the requirement that state child welfare and local child welfare agencies take into account the proximity to school has been an established requirement in 4E for some time. What's new to Fostering Connections is the addition of this word appropriateness of the current education setting. And I think all of the new attention around educational stability has brought new light and new focus on the issues of appropriateness and proximity. What does this piece really mean when we talk about educational stability? What we're talking about here is that when children come into care, or when there's living placement changes while a child is in care, if we are able to keep children living close to their schools and ensure that those schools that they are attending are the appropriate place and meeting the child's needs, that we don't need to move on to some of the other topics that we're going to be discussing in this webinar, that is how to transport a child from one area to another to continue enrollment in a previous school when that's best for them. So if they remain living close, still feeding into the same school districts, none of the complex mobility issues come into play. So how does that play out in context and in practice? And we see on slide 10 that this has always been best practice, and I'm sure many of you from child welfare agencies on the line are hearing this and thinking we always try to keep children placed close to their home communities or school communities, but sometimes that's a real struggle. The need to recruit and retain more resource families within school and neighborhood communities is certainly a need in many states, if not all states. There are some examples, though, where this issue of keeping children close to their communities, layered with keeping children close to their communities as it relates to their school needs and their school stability, has really found some success. And we just cite here a few examples of some of the geo-mapping programs. Illinois has a program known as Schoolminder, and there's several others around the country that really look at mapping out where children are being removed from, where are they being placed, how many miles are those distances, not only layering over a regional map, but layering over a school boundaries map over that local map to see how often are we able to maintain and which areas might we need to increase some targeted recruitment efforts to maintain children in their same school. I'm going to move on because, again, while this is an important piece to think about when we talk about transportation, it's really some of these strategies or issues that could avoid needing to think about transportation. But I'm going to move on to slide 11. Where we get to sort of the meat of some of the education stability provisions. And what these provisions say is within a child's case plan, there must be a school stability plan that includes assurances that a state has coordinated with appropriate local education agencies to ensure that a child remains enrolled in the school in which the child was enrolled at the time of placement. If remaining in the same school is not in the best interest of the child, assurances by that state agency and the local education agency to provide immediate and appropriate enrollment in a new school with all of the educational records to follow. So if we move on to slide 12, these stability provisions are really the heart of fostering connections, and when folks talk about the education provisions of fostering connections, often these are the two that folks are thinking about. And it opens a whole host of questions which we do not have enough time in this 1-hour webinar to discuss, but what are some of the examples? One is this determination about what is in a child's best interest, which is very critical to these decisions. I've just pointed to you on slide 12 here some resources that our Legal Center has created to help in thinking about the school selections, including thinking about factors to consider when making best interest determinations. Again, remembering the presumption in fostering connections is the child remains in their same school unless it's determined that it's not in their best interest to do so. And then, of course, there's the topic of immediate enrollment. If the child is going to be immediately enrolled into a new school, living in a placement that feeds directly into that new school, transportation really is an issue. The child would be entitled to transportation as any other student living there would. But there are issues with how to make immediate enrollment seamless. There are issues about who makes the decisions about best interest, what about disputes, and what about identifying critical points of contact within child welfare agencies and education agencies to ensure that all of this coordination and collaboration that's necessary to see these education stabilities through are in place and that there is support to make these things happen for children in care. I'm going to move on to slide 13 because, again, we're not quite to the point where we talk about the transportation needs for children who, when it's in their best interest to remain in their original school. I think before we can get there, there's a few more things we have to discuss, and that is remembering that not all children in care are going to require new or additional transportation to remain in their same school. Often I think when we talk about this transportation piece, we think, oh, well, we've got X number of children in custody in our county or in our state, and we're going to need to transport all of them. And I think it's important to try to think that through and figure out which children are we really talking about. And this slide here on 13 is really just trying to lay out a visual for you about thinking of it in terms of an equation of what are some of the categories or circumstances or which kids who might not be requiring transportation. So let's think this through. First, of course, you need to know how many children are in care in your state, in your jurisdiction. And from that, then think about how many of those children in care are not really school age. Now, understanding that there are some state provisions that allow these kind of school stability provisions. Connecticut, we're going to talk about in a minute, expands the school stability piece to children who are eligible for special education between the ages of 3 and 5. We have some states with mandatory pre-K. But with those exceptions aside, really looking at our very young child population who are not yet school age and sort of deleting those from the number of kids we're talking about with potential transportation needs. Then, of course, we have our older kids, our kids who have graduated and hopefully moving on to post-secondary education or employment pursuits, kids who have left are no longer part of the K-12 educational experience. We also have to think about the number of kids who we just were talking about placed within the school boundaries, so that normal rules apply as they do for all students. Those children will continue to attend the school that they feed into, and there's no exceptions or no additional transportation needs in play. We also then have to take a look at the number of children who it is not in their best interest to remain in their current or previous school and that they need to be immediately enrolled in a new school. For those kids, transportation will be what all students receive. There will be no additional or new transportation needs required. There's two more things I have listed here. One, children covered under the McKinney-Vento Act, and children who have transportation in their IEP. And I think both of these are important to just discuss and sort of move past before we can get to the heart of our presentation. So if you go to slide 14, let me talk about McKinney-Vento just for a minute. I imagine most folks on the call are familiar with the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. It is an education law that's designed to ensure that children and youth who meet a definition of a homeless child or youth receive a free and appropriate public education, and it's designed to remove all the obstacles that delay enrollment and access to school. So that includes allowing children to remain in their school of origin if it's in their best interest to do so, and immediate access to school. It sounds very familiar because it's very similar to the provisions we just talked about that exist for all children in foster care under Fostering Connections. A key provision under McKinney-Vento is transportation must be provided by the school system to remain in their same school. If we go to slide 15, we realize that the issue about McKinney-Vento and children in foster care stems from the definition of homeless child and youth under McKinney. And as you can see, there are the definition includes individuals who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, and includes children living in emergency or transitional shelters, children abandoned in hospitals, unaccompanied homeless youth, as well as children awaiting foster care placement. Many of you on the call may have heard this terminology, not exactly sure perhaps what it means. And one of the issues with awaiting foster care placement is it's a term that's in the law but has no official definition. Many states have grappled with this awaiting foster care placement, and some have chosen to use McKinney-Vento as a way to serve some children in foster care in their states. On slide 16, I'm just going to leave you with a overview of some of the critical resources that exist to help you if you want to learn more about McKinney, including does your state have an official awaiting foster care placement definition? How does McKinney-Vento and Fostering Connections work in practice when there's overlap? Some children are McKinney eligible only, some children are Fostering Connections eligible only, and then there's going to be some children in states that are eligible under both, and how that works and plays out. And so we've also provided you with some links to some issue briefs. All of this can be found on the Legal Center's website of materials to help deal with this intricate issue. Again, for purposes of this presentation, I point out McKinney-Vento only to say if your state has a concrete McKinney definition and there is some piece of children in foster care who already are eligible under McKinney and the McKinney rules and transportation is being provided by the school district, this is not the piece. Transportation is already being provided, and this is not the group that we have to look at for who needs additional transportation. If we go to slide 18, let's also talk about special education. We've been receiving questions, and I think some of the questions submitted from audience members ask questions about how Fostering Connections overlaps with special education issues. When a child is in care is eligible for special ed, he or she must have what's known as an individualized educational program. That's an IEP. So this is for children with identified disabilities that are impacting on their ability to make educational progress. They have an educational program, an IEP in place that outlines what the child's needs and service interventions are. IEPs can include things known as related services, any service that will allow the child to benefit from his or her special ed program. Transportation is one of those things that can be identified on an IEP as a related service, as long as that IEP team determines it's necessary for the child to benefit from special ed programs. But please don't misunderstand my including this as in any way saying that school mobility as a separate issue, it can be addressed in an IEP. All I'm pointing out here is that an IEP can have transportation written in, which means a child who is in special ed with transportation in his IEP may be specifically mandated to receive transportation to a particular school placement. That could address the issue of school mobility that we're talking about. But its purpose for being included in the IEP is to address his access to a program that can meet the child's disabilities. I think this might be a good time to pause for just a second and say there's a lot of information that's being presented in this presentation. Our Legal Center, as well as I hope mentioned that there'll be some follow-up question and answers submitted to the audience. We're working on an issue brief that will be released before the end of the summer that talks in great detail about a lot of the issues that we're discussing today. So for those of you that are following along, wonderful. For some of you who are wanting additional information on some of the topics I'm mentioning, I really encourage you to stay tuned for some additional resources that we'll be creating. So finally, on slide 19, we get to the focus for today. And that is really what I want everyone to put aside a lot of the other questions that you might have about best interest, about immediate enrollment, and just think for today that we are focusing on this particular issue. A child who it's been determined that it's in their best interest to remain in a school, that they were enrolled in the time of placement, they're living outside of that school's feeder area, and that there needs to be continuing that enrollment is critical and requires some form of transportation. And again, some form of transportation need beyond what is provided to other students. And so what do we do with that situation? Because as we can see, if we're making best interest determinations about whether the child should stay or go, what we know is the cost of transportation cannot be a factor in making that determination. And therefore, we are going to have situations where children need to be transported back to their original school, and we need to solve that transportation problem. So let's go to slide 20 and look at some big picture issues and some big themes that I want to point out. Number one, educational stability requirements apply to all children in care, not just kids who are 4E eligible. And that really stems from a lot of cross-referencing between Title 4E and Title 4B of the Social Security Act. And since all states receive some 4B and 4E dollars, all children in care in this country are required to have case plans, which includes now the educational stability plans, where these educational stability requirements are found. If the Child Welfare Agency must ensure that children stay in their current school, and if it's in their best interest to do so, then it follows that there is some ultimate responsibility there to ensure that transportation happens when it's needed. And so what does that mean? It means that costs have to somehow be addressed. Fostering Connections doesn't tell us precisely how to address those costs. It can be through child welfare funding alone, it can be through education funding alone, or it can be some collaboration across agencies to fund that transportation. Fostering Connections requires collaboration across agencies. That we know from the direct language of the education stability provisions. And so the intent there is that that collaboration be about anything that's needed to maintain stability. That includes transportation. And finally, remember that the dependency courts, there is a role for courts here. They have the ability, requirement to oversee those, the child's case plan, ability to ensure school stability and care is part of that now. And we have to make sure that there's documentation of that plan and overseeing whether or not the transportation is happening. So the role of courts is pretty critical. On slide 21, we'll just take one more minute to talk about, yes, transportation is needed. It's best for the child to stay in their old school. But you know what? There's going to be situations where that transportation might be provided with no real significant additional transportation costs. And I just point out some examples here of situations that could be provided. Now, when I say no additional transportation costs, it might require some people time. It might require some coordination, an arrangement of the transportation, some collaboration and conversations across agencies to make it happen. There's just no additional need for cost. So what are some of the examples we point out here on slide 21? We've got the child moves within the same school district to a different school, but transportation exists across that district for other reasons. Perhaps it's a large school district with magnet programs, with charter schools, with a whole host of different reasons, special education needs, and special programs that crisscross across the county, where there is an intricate grid of transportation and busing that crosses over the typical boundary lines. And so that perhaps all it needs kids in care who might need transportation across a county or across a district would be to just be allowed to have a seat on an existing bus. A child moves to a new school district but can cross the street or be dropped at a bus stop close by to access the old district's existing transportation system. We certainly have heard a lot anecdotally from young children who are aging out of care or who have exited care, and we hear these stories more and more often. A child who really wanted to stay in their same school could think up a really easy way. I could walk to my old bus stop. I wasn't that far away, but I just didn't know that I could ask. I didn't know what people's reaction would be if I did ask to go. And so often there's a lot of consensus that we want to keep kids staying in their same school. We understand the concept behind school stability, but maybe we're intimidated by what it might mean to provide it, or the costs need to be addressed. Here's a situation where there were no costs, but nobody asked the questions, nobody pursued the issue, and a child wasn't able to have school stability. Adding a new bus stop to a pre-existing bus route. School districts' bus routes to converge. Recently in 2009, Louisiana passed a state law, and there is a trend of states addressing school stability in their state legislation. And in Louisiana's law, it requires the Child Welfare Agency to be responsible for arranging transportation of a child to a drop-off and pickup point within a school district. So really to figure out, okay, the child can ride on bus route 57, and bus route 57 crisscrosses, comes very close to bus route 66, and the child can be dropped off and picked up and still be able to maintain in their same school. And finally, adults in the child's life whose existing commutes complement the child's transportation needs. Of course, we don't always have that ability to have transportation at no cost. And so what are we talking about when we talk about transportation costs to keep children in school? Well, on slide 22, you see some of the examples we hear most often. A foster parent, a relative, or other significant adult needs to provide transportation but needs reimbursement for mileage. An agency provides a youth or caretaker bus passes or other public transportation vouchers. An agency contracts with private transportation companies to provide buses, vans, cars, or a school has to reroute, add a bus to a fleet to accommodate a new transportation need. All those are transportation issues that come at some cost. And so really what we need to look at is, what does Fostering Connections tell us about transportation costs? Well, in slide 23, you see the direct language that comes from Fostering Connections about transportation. And this is what it says. The term foster care maintenance payments includes reasonable travel for the child to remain in the school in which the child is enrolled at the time of placement. So what this means is foster care maintenance payments, those dollars that support a child, maintains a child in a foster care placement, things like food, clothing, shelter, daily supervision, school supplies. Now reasonable travel for the child to remain in the school in which they were enrolled at the time of placement is added to that definition. What does that mean? Let's take a look at slide 24, and let's put out a few reminders as we think about this. Number one, the use of 4E dollars applies only to 4E eligible children. So because foster care maintenance payments are a form of 4E payment, it can only be used to reimburse if a child is 4E eligible. What makes a child 4E eligible? That answer is a little complicated. It dates back to some criterion. One example is it's based on AFDC guidelines from 1996, among other provisions. I think what's important for this call to know is not all children in foster care are going to be 4E eligible, and it's really critical for advocates, whether you're in schools, child welfare agencies, the courts, legal system. You need to know what percentage of kids in your jurisdiction or in your state are 4E eligible. Now remember, I said the case plan requirements, the requirement to maintain stability is for all kids. The use of the 4E dollars is going to be limited to just some kids. Bullet number 2 reminder is it's a permissible use of administrative or maintenance dollars. So it's not mandating that a child welfare agency use these dollars. It's permitting them to. It's got to be up to the agency whether or not they're going to use this ability to draw down federal reimbursement, federal dollars, to support support the transportation costs. There is going to be a required state match, whether it's administrative dollars or maintenance dollars. We're going to talk about the difference there in a second. Is that there is a requirement that there be some state dollars to match that federal reimbursement. And finally, there is going to be a group of kids who are not going to be 4E eligible, or where neither 4E maintenance or 4E admin can really be used. So what are some of the issues, the outstanding issues? Well, before I get to that, I think finally, in terms of a big picture about $40 and $40 reimbursement. I think this new language and some of the new guidance, and so new that some of it has just been released as of this Friday, is that a piece of the funding puzzle around keeping kids in their same school can be solved with some $40. It is not going to solve the entire transportation cost puzzle, and I think that's an important piece to remember, is that it's a piece, it's an important piece, and we want to make sure we understand how to use it and use it appropriately to solve a piece of the puzzle, and continue to find ways to solve the other pieces. So other outstanding issues that we're hopefully going to attempt to address here in the next few minutes are, what about other transportation costs related to remaining in the school at the time of placement? What about a caretaker attending a school meeting or extracurricular activities? How can reimbursements be calculated? What is the mathematical piece of this? And how is all of this working in states? Let's go to the little conversation about this difference between administrative costs and maintenance costs, and talk about what some of the clear direction and guidance we have on some of these issues. So we talked about maintenance costs, about the cost of maintaining kids in their foster care placements, and certainly Fostering Connections as of October 2008 has made clear that school transportation can be part of a foster care maintenance cost. Just this Friday, we had some very important clarification coming out of ACS from HHS that helped to clarify a couple of points. Number one, clarify that these costs, the use of this foster care maintenance dollars, not only can support cost of transporting at a child's initial placement into care, so an initial school change, but it can be used with any subsequent school changes. So really giving states the most flexibility to use and draw down the $40 maintenance dollars in those situations. It clarified that payments can be made to the child's provider or a separate payment directly to the transportation provider. There had been some need for clarity that this just isn't just something that is part of a foster care maintenance payment that goes directly to a foster parent or a caretaker, but that this can be a separate payment, and that the separate payment doesn't have to only go to a foster caretaker. It can also go directly to a transportation provider. And then finally, clarification that transportation for a child to remain in their school of origin is also an allowable Title IV administrative cost. So Title IV administrative costs are those costs necessary for the proper and efficient administration of a 4E state plan. And because it was determined that these costs are related to case management, they clearly fall under an allowable administration cost. Again, this gives states the most amount of flexibility. They can claim it as a maintenance cost. They can claim it as an administrative cost. So if we go to slide 26, here I'm just providing a few resources. So again, for both maintenance or admin, we can't say it enough, only can be used for 4E eligible children. Again, to find out what percentage of children in your state are 4E eligible, we've provided a link here for a resource that the Child Welfare League of America put together. These are estimates. These aren't hard and fast numbers. This tool was based on 2008 statistics, but I think it's helpful to let you know sort of where your state falls. Is it 20%? Is it 80% of their kids in care are 4A eligible? I think it's important when you think about thinking about how to address transportation costs. Again, the differences between maintenance and admin costs, we talked a little bit about sort of what they are. Here, the dollar and cents related to the differences is that the maintenance match rate varies by state and can be anywhere from 50% to right now, with the ARA bump as high as 83% match rate. That means that's the federal reimbursement. States need to match the rest. Administrative rates are a set 50%. So in all states, doesn't matter where you are, administrative rates are at 50%. We're also providing here a link to a chart that will tell you your state's FMAP rate, which is your reimbursement rate, based on, I believe, 2011. I'm going to pause for just a minute. I know Dennis is on the line. Dennis Blasey, who's a consultant with the Fostering Connections Resource Center. Just want to pause and see if there's any additional comments he may have before we move on.
Yeah, a couple. something I would stress is that when looking at the eligibility ratio on that link, that it's only generally a proxy for the rate of eligibility that would actually impact any cost distributions. Because again, not all 4E eligible children or ineligible children are going to need the transportation as a cost, and indeed the actual rate of eligibility within the population that actually requires the transportation with a new cost that is distributable for 4E may actually be higher or lower than that proxy eligibility ratio. But it gives you a good sense of where to start the conversation.
Kathy, are you on the line?
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I had the mute on for when Dennis was talking. So I'm going to move on to slide 27, which is the talking and provide to you some of the clear language from some recent and some not so recent guidance from the Child Welfare Policy Manual. As you can see on slide 27, a little bit of what, reiterating a little bit of what we've already highlighted and summarized, that transportation for reasonable travel for the child to remain in the school in which the child is enrolled at the time of placement is an allowable separate item of expense. So if anybody's in a state that's thinking this can't be a separate payment, it certainly is from a federal perspective an allowable separate item of expense. Local transportation associated with some of those basic need issues, food, clothing, daily supervision, is presumably included in the 4E foster care payment. But this definitely pulls out that transportation for reasonable travel is an allowable separate item of expense. Slide 28 also points out a few issues that I haven't heard a lot of talk about, but it could be something that we will start hearing, and that is sort of other costs. Other transportation type costs related to children staying in their original schools. And one here that comes directly from the Child Welfare Policy Manual is that other transportation associated with the child's attendance at his or her school of origin is an allowable administrative cost under Title 4E. So this could be a caretaker attending a school meeting for the child, and it could be extracurricular activities related to the child continuing in that school. The second bullet is from a separate question, and I think makes clear that transportation to or from extracurricular activities that substitute for daily supervision is also an allowable and presumed to be included in the basic 4E foster care maintenance payment. So what that's saying is there also is some 4E foster care maintenance reimbursement for extracurriculars, part of daily supervision. So an example might be a before and after care for a child as extended care. How to calculate reimbursements, I mean, this can get quite tricky. I think the biggest question that we hear is, can we use 4E dollars to reimburse other entities that provide the transportation for the child? And so the short answer is yes, we can. But again, remember that when we're using 4E dollars, we must be able to connect it directly to the 4E eligible child. There might be a need to devise some kind of formula to be able to track and determine costs per child, how much does transportation cost per day, per child, and then be able to acknowledge which children are 4E eligible. And much will depend on how your state designs and structures your 4E maintenance and administrative payments. We don't have all the answers here in this national level webinar. I think a lot of what our goal here today is to raise with you some of the key questions that perhaps you bring to your state or to your local discussions around these issues and really get some of your local specifics and local answers. And so that's really the intent of the next two slides, is to provide you with some quick checklists that summarize some of the answers you're going to need to determine how to address this on the ground in your state. And so the first slide is some of these general transportation questions we have. It goes back to that formula that we made up at the beginning of the presentation. How many school-age foster children do we have? Are we talking about? What percentage are placed within school boundaries? What percentage are placed at such far distances or have other reasons for it not being in their best interest to remain in their original school? I have to pause here and just comment that, you know, estimating how many kids is not going to be in their best interest to remain is a very big challenge, I think, because that is a child-specific determination. Best interest determinations are specific to the child. And so to be able to estimate, well, in any given year in my community, how many is it going to be best or not best for, that's going to be a challenge. What is our state McKinney-Vento policy? Where does awaiting foster care placement or McKinney-Vento come into the equation in our community? What percentage of children in care is the IEP provision I pointed out? Are they getting transportation with their IEPs, and that transportation will address school stability? Some of the transportation might not. And then what are our state and school district policies for all students about transporting children within a school district or between school districts? There are a handful of states out there that allow for school stability or school choice for all students, and so there doesn't need to be anything unique created for children in care. But then there are those states and there are those policies that allow for some exceptions for children in foster care, and we really need to know what they are. Slide 31 points out some of these very specific questions in understanding 4E and where and how 4E dollars can be used to support some of the school transportation costs. What percentage of children in care are 4E eligible in our jurisdiction? What is your state's reimbursement rate, your FMAP rate? How are your 4E maintenance payments structured? Can transportation costs be added to the core payment? Is it a separate payment to be made? How are your 4E administration payments structured? Which makes sense in your state? You're given the option. So does it make sense to claim this as a 4E administrative cost or as a maintenance cost? Who will be actually providing the additional transportation needed to keep kids in their same school? Will there be a number of methods used, and what needs to be thought out in determining how we're going to reimburse for each of those various methods? What schools or other entities are providing the additional transportation? Do you have a formula that allows for calculating specific costs for the 4E eligible child? If you're in a 4E waiver state, do provisions of your waiver impact how these payments can be calculated or made? Again, I know we haven't answered all the questions here today. This is as good an overview as we can provide to you in an hour-long webinar. But we want to close out here and really talk about a few examples of places that are addressing some of these transportation and cost issues. And what I'd like to do, as you see on slide 32, I point out some of the key themes that I want you to listen out for as we run through some of these state examples. I would categorize them in 4 ways. The first is collaboration. There's not a single example we're going to highlight today that doesn't involve collaboration across agencies. Child welfare agencies in none of these situations develop these policies alone. Education agencies were at the table, as well as in many of the situations, many of the other leading and critical stakeholders. Another key theme I want you to listen out for in these states is about flexibility and the need to allow some flexibility. We've seen it from some of the, in the very recent guidance from the Children's Bureau. We see a theme of flexibility and allowing states to figure out ways to serve, to allow for school stability and to serve children. And we also see a theme that states and with their counties need to allow for flexibility for what makes the most sense on the ground. A need to articulate clear responsibilities for cost as well as for the actual provision of that transportation. How is it going to happen? What's the responsibility of child welfare? What's the responsibility of education? Where are the costs going to fall? If they're going to be shared, how are they going to be divided? For that to be articulated and clearly set is going to be critical. And finally, the designation of additional dollars beyond the use of 4E. As we said, 4E provides a piece of the puzzle. It does not solve the entire puzzle of cost of transportation. So my first example that we've pointed out on slides 32 and 34 is the state of Connecticut. And for anybody on the line who did not hear, Effective just in July and passed, I believe in early June, maybe May, a new school stability law that really reflects a lot of the key provisions and has taken the Fostering Connections education provisions and really adopted them to the state of Connecticut. There's a lot to be learned from or seen as an example in this Connecticut stability law. Here on this, and I've provided a link to the actual legislation. Under Bullet 1. Under Bullet 2, I've just really highlighted some of the key transportation provisions that are pointed out in that law. Things like the need for an actual transportation plan, clearly designating the Department of Children and Families as the responsible entity for any of the additional or extraordinary costs of transportation, a requirement to make sure that the use of 4E is being maximized and sought, and finally that the collaborative work between children and families and the Board of Education is cost-effective, reliable, and safe. Probably the most unique piece to Connecticut is that there was a new appropriations of $3 million allocated in the state budget to support child welfare agencies, which, as anyone on the call would realize, is just really tremendous considering the economic crisis that many states are facing. And so I'm going to see if either Cindy Butterfield or Barbara Clare are unmuted and want to chime in at all, either at my very quick summary about Connecticut's law, or to talk about what's on the last bullet of 34, which is what steps they've been taking to develop an RFP to actually try to provide the transportation that's needed.
Kathy, this is Carrie. They're all on the line, but I'm afraid that their audio is not functioning properly for them to talk over the phone.
Okay. Well, what I'll say is, and we certainly are running very low on time, and I apologize to Cindy or Barbara if you're somehow muted and have things that you're dying to say, is that perhaps in the Q&A that we respond to in the next week, we can make sure that any comments, additional comments they had, that we can provide to the audience in that way. Moving on to the next example we have, I guess I should also point out that in Connecticut is a state-administered child welfare structure, and the next example we have is Minnesota, which is a county-administered. And an interesting bulletin, a guidance from Department of Human Services in Minnesota that came across my desk a few weeks ago is a brand new bulletin issued only about a month ago, really trying to provide some guidance to the Child Welfare County administrators around school stability for kids in care. And it gets very specific related to the financial claims. As you see, it really spells out, and in a good way, I think, it is supported, I believe, pretty strongly by the new program instruction that was just released on Friday from the federal office. But talking that child welfare agencies should work with foster parents to provide transportation and making clear that there's flexibility. It can be an increase in their difficulty of care, so that's their foster care maintenance level of care, how they determine the amount a foster parent might be provided. But it also can be a separate payment to that foster parent, so it doesn't have to be part of the basic payment. It can be a separate payment specifically addressing the actual cost, be it a mileage reimbursement, be it hiring of some other resource to provide the transportation. It can be a separate payment to another provider, so it could be a private contract with a transportation service, and it can be the local school district. Really, maximum amount of flexibility being the theme there. It allows for retroactive reimbursement from October 2008, and they're working to make the changes to their data system and their reporting structure so that I think the retroactive reimbursements are going to have to be done by paper, by hand, but that the future reimbursements are going to be able to work through their regular structure. I would assume the same mute issue is for Jesse Haynell at the Youth Law Center in California.
Yeah,
is that right, Carrie?
That's the case, unless you try speaking, Jesse.
Are you there, Jesse?
I'm afraid we've got the same audio.
Yeah, Well, again, apologies to Jesse. He's with the Youth Law Center and has been a tremendous advocate in California around education issues for children in foster care. And he was the one who brought to my attention some examples from 2 of the counties in California that have really developed some real models of collaborative approaches to ensure that foster children and youth receive transportation. Definitely an emphasis on case-by-case strategy. These are child-specific determinations. We've really got to stay true to what the specific child's needs are. In California, they're accessing McKinney-Vento whenever it's applicable, whenever a child meets that definition, but otherwise costs are being distributed among many parties. In San Diego, the cost of transportation is usually covered by an equal split between the school district of residence and the school district of origin. Social workers coordinate the transportation for individual kids, which may take the form of foster parents, reimbursing foster parents for mileage, paying for public transportation, allowing child welfare or school district personnel to provide the transportation. Another county in California, Butte County, relies on a 5-way cost-sharing plan among the Butte County Office of Ed, Child Services Division of the Department of Social and Employment Services, the Foster Family Agency, the District of Attendance, and the District of Residency. So certainly a model of collaborative approaches. The logistics are coordinated through a central person in the Office of Ed. I think another thing that I guess I didn't point out, but I noticed in Butte, having that centralized person. In Connecticut, one of the pieces that I know Cindy would have spoken about is that in the RFPs that in Connecticut that they're putting out to bidders for the transportation contract is that a requirement that anyone bidding must have in place a transportation coordinator. And I think that point of contact to deal with issues, to troubleshoot, to make sure things are in place is certainly critical. Finally, a city example on slide 37. We just wanted to highlight that there's been a lot of work in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, between the Department of Human Services and the School District of Philadelphia, and they've developed some really model joint protocols. And there they've been focusing really on the distance, the radius from the school, and have some really articulated policies. If the child is within 1.5-mile radius of the school, that the foster parent is responsible and eligible for reimbursement outside of that 1.5 radius. It talks about what needs to be explored, public transportation. DHS can submit requests to guidance counselors for busing. They can submit requests for counselors to provide transit passes, and really having a process for those complex cases. And we're always going to face those cases that are with unique circumstances, that there's a process to really assess and come up with the right supports. So that's just a really very fast attempt to highlight for you a variety of ways that transportation, both costs and providing the actual transportation, are being addressed in different jurisdictions around the country. And slide 38, you have my contact information, and I really welcome your questions, your comments, and really I would also really welcome any examples that you might have of how you are dealing with some of these transportation requirements in your state. We constantly are receiving information, and we'll share those with the group as we get them. Finally, on slide 39, I just want to remind you, and I know if Hope we're still on the line, she would want to remind everyone that the Fostering Connections Resource Center is available to help and answer questions and to contact them directly at the web link provided. There's a limited amount of technical assistance the Resource Center can provide, and also that needs to be coordinated through them. And then you can also contact us. We're the lead network partner with the Resource Center, and our contact information is available. Don't forget, if there's any 2 websites that you check out after you leave this call, I would really, really encourage you to take a look at www.fosteringconnections.org. If you focus on education provisions of Fostering Connections or any of the other provisions, it is a wealth of information and resources. If you're particularly interested in educational needs, both of Fostering Connection provisions, but beyond those, I encourage you to take a look at our website, the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education. I want to thank you for your participation and your patience today, and just to remind you that the next Fostering Connections Resource Center webinar will be on August 10th at 1 p.m. I believe that's Eastern Time, and also on August 12th at 3:30 p.m., and the topic will be tribal issues, with presenters from the Resource Center and the National Indian Child Welfare Association. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing from you.